everyone. Good morning. Great to see you. And if you all like data, there was some data from the last panel. There was some data on the screen. You're in for a treat. We have both qualitative and quantitative data today from our two presenters who are going to, this is sort of lightning round, so they're going to quickly present their data on really, I think, one of the subjects that is on everyone's minds right now, which is young people and their views of populism. So I'm going to hand it over to our panelists, Abby and Simon. Abby, do you want to get started?
So we've seen throughout the conference great examples of young people as champions of democracy. But I think that we cannot assume that young people are going to save democracy, because unfortunately, sometimes young people are the ones who are the most open to authoritarianism. And so my job as a researcher is to try to build this picture of young people's views on authoritarianism through interviews, through working with schools, big survey data, and then inevitably as an academic, so I'm a research fellow in the African Studies Centre of Oxford, and your own students will inform your views as well about what does it mean to be part of that younger generation. And so, for example, one of my students from Nigeria said to me, you know what our country really needs is another coup. And he said, you know, he remembers his parents talking about public executions during the dictatorship, but he said, you know, this democracy thing is just not working. And in that moment, that really crystallized for me something that I've been seeing across different parts of my research. It's not to dismiss that young people's energy can help to renew democracy, that's certainly the case, but it can just as easily fuel this authoritarian nostalgia. And this comes out quite clearly in the research that I've done with Dr. Katja Salomo. She's an expert on radicalization in Europe, and then I bring the Africa expertise, and so we've done this comparison of Europe and Africa, how generations' views on authoritarianism have changed over the last 20 years, sort of 1999 to 2022. And the story that comes out of Europe and the story that comes out of Africa are quite different. In liberal democracies in Europe, we saw this big spike in openness to authoritarianism after the 2008 crash. And that was across age groups, but it goes up the most for people who were young at the time.
Okay.
So millennials, my generation, people who were finishing school at the time, who were trying to get their first job, other cohorts would have been buying their first houses during this period. And what happens is that even though over time that openness to authoritarianism decreases for all age groups, European millennials still stand out. Their openness to authoritarianism is still greater than previous cohorts were at their age. Gen Z too, but not as much as millennials. And so what this tells us is that potentially crises, like economic crises, affect young people's views the most in those crucial transitional moments in life, and it may affect their confidence in democracy going forward even after the crisis is averted. And my fear is that as we're seeing difficulties of getting first jobs due to generative AI, the housing crisis continuing, we could see Gen Z and Gen Alpha having the same problem as those millennials eventually, that their first steps into adulthood are steps into crisis. The difference with the African democracies that we looked at was that even though in Europe there was this recovery that openness to authoritarianism starts to go down, in Africa rather we've seen recently, sort of post-2015, that across age groups openness to authoritarianism has been going up. And that in and of itself is very worrying. But what adds fuel to the fire is that in many cases, it's young people who are leading that trend. And the reason why this is so worrying is that as those young people become the leaders, the decision makers, the voters, that trend can accelerate. So last night, Lindiwe Mazibuko talked about young South Africans not voting in the election. We found that young South Africans are the most open to authoritarianism. And so, for example, one woman said, you know, why she wasn't voting in the elections is because she saw democracy as a pyramid scheme, just people who were elected getting richer and richer. And so the question is, can we give young people a reason to believe that more democracy is the answer and not less democracy?
Okay, great. Simon, take it away. I know you've got some slides.
Yeah, you already alluded to it. Let's see if, it's working. Wonderful. Oh, that's us. Thanks for inviting me. I'm here for a wonderful team of researchers and importantly, civil society actors who are part of this work. And we're finding ourselves we're in Europe, and we did some work in these 5 countries, the 5 largest EU countries, so Spain, France, Italy, Germany, and Poland. And in these 5 countries, you have 82, roughly, million youth and young adults, Gen Z, millennials, 16 to 39-year-olds, whichever version you prefer. And we drew a representative sample and asked them quite recently, as you see, this summer, a lot of questions. And these data aren't out yet, so it's a little sneak preview here. And what we find is 1 in 4, 25%, are open to anti-democratic appeals. They increasingly question rule of law. They question non-violence. They question civilized debate. And here just a few, we asked many questions, just to give you a flavor, like the top left corner, and a question on online trolling. Second one would be more on violence against politicians. Third one on breaking rules to push through your agenda. And 25% do not agree to all of those and the others that we asked, but a majority. 11% agree to all of them. All the questions in this direction that we asked, and that's quite worrying for European democracies. We then are currently investigating who is who, and age seems to play a role. We also find that millennials, or people in their early 30s, are most susceptible to these tactics. And then gender plays a role too. Men are more susceptible at almost 1 in 6. And then lonely men in particular, so men who will say, I feel isolated from others, up to almost 20%, up to almost 1 in 5. And we're investigating this as part of a larger project on backlash politics, oftentimes used backlash as, this policy we don't like, so there's a backlash against the policy or something somebody said. But we agree with many scholars say this is actually a concerted strategy, oftentimes utilized by authoritarian populist parties and backlash movements, such as the Manosphere, for example, or anti-migrant movements. And the strategy essentially has 2 components. One would be weaponizing nostalgia, sort of alleging that there was a better society before that we need to go back to, make America great again. This blurry again has plays its role, or a society when men were real men, when women knew their place, when there were no migrants. So this is one component, and the other one is we need to go back with all means, even democratic ones. This is a political strategy, and we are looking into, does it fly with people and with young people? And through a lot of qual and quant and talking to civil society actors, we came up here at the moment. We see it as a process of anti-democratic escalation, where the root is what we hear often, political disillusionment, which is almost a feature, not a bug, it seems. That's not the problem per se, but it's a breeding ground. Then you have what we call retrograde aspirations, so this nostalgia, and to sign up to, okay, maybe there was a better society that we should go back to. 43% of young people in these 5 countries agree with that. And it gets really problematic when you say, I want to go back, and I actually want to go back when men were calling the shots, and I want to go back when minorities were silenced, and I want to go back when we didn't fetishize over the darker chapters of our history. That's 28% of young people who agree with this. And then from there, the path to these anti-democratic tactics is very short, we find. So,
okay. All right, well, I have so many questions, so we'll try to get through them. The first is, okay, clearly you guys have done lots of research in Europe, here for you in Europe and in Africa, but the question that immediately comes to mind, we've just seen in Nepal, in Indonesia, and other places, what people are calling these Gen Z protest movements, anti-government, anti-corruption, and apparently led by young people. They seem to be leaning into, what we considered the democratic freedoms of protest. Like, how do you think about these movements? Like, are they outliers? Like, what do they tell you about young people's politics right now? I mean, as researchers, look at those movements through your lens. What do you see?
I think perhaps even though it's legitimate to concentrate on young people and seeing them visibly on the streets, we also need to think about how that interacts with other sections of society who might not be as visible within the protests, but what do their parents at home think? Are they agreeing with these young people? In which case, going back to that question of, is this going to accelerate a trend or is it going to hold it back? Because when you have the general population agreeing with the protesters, then that's going to facilitate that movement. But when you have more intergenerational conflict, then that protest movement is going to face higher barriers. You also have the question of potentially outside actors. So the coups that we've seen in the Sahel, we've often seen photographs of young men out in the streets, mysteriously with these Russian flags, and who in the Sahel just has a Russian flag at home to bring out onto a protest? And so you also have to question sometimes whether there are other external forces at play here that are facilitating these movements as well.
Okay, and I know some of these questions haven't been answered, and there's, I think, a lot more to see with these, so thank you for raising those. So Simon, one question I had for you, particularly since you focus so much, since your research right now focuses on Europe, I'm curious about the role that demographics plays. I mean, most of the countries in Europe, they're quite old. Like, is this really that dissatisfaction, that frustration, is it really just sort of the frustration of young people with a society where it seems like the older people have all the power, frustration with the status quo that's sort of being expressed as frustration with democracy because, you know, liberal democracy is, for the most part, the status quo?
Yeah, we didn't go in just assuming it's all about like political disillusionment. So we also ran questions on economic deprivation, economic concerns, sort of cultural war questions. But the political questions polled most potently, actually, when it comes to this dynamic. So yeah, it's many things at the same time, and some may work as an amplifier of those. But this really solid political disillusionment seems to be like the basis for this kind of escalation. Mm-hmm.
And what do you think about, does lived experience matter? I mean, here we're talking about people who, you know, they're teenagers, 20s, 30s. In most of these countries, their lived experience is with liberal democracy of some kind, or democratic systems of some kind. Do you think, and again, I know this is not directly in your research, but do you think that the experience of, you know, living through the Cold War, living through what it's actually like to be under the governance of authoritarian populism, do you think that might change some of these outcomes?
Well, I think one thing that I might cheekily infer from some of our research was that in places that have not become liberal democracies in the past, but have remained stagnant at what we call electoral democracies, and have not experienced sort of significant, huge declines or huge jumps in that. So I'm thinking of Senegal, Malawi, and then in Europe you would have Romania and Bulgaria, that we see openness to authoritarianism increasing with each recent generation. So in that case, Gen Z is more authoritarian than millennials. And I think that it could be that sense of stagnation and the memories of authoritarianism receding kind of creates a increasing sense of hopelessness among young people. And I think that raises the question of how do we transmit memories of authoritarianism? So my concern working with schools on this question of historical memory has been this framing of, you know, pros and cons of authoritarianism. They say, oh, you know, all these terrible things happened, but then there were these supposed development or modernization, and this feeds into this mythology that dictatorship is going to bring us development. And I think that's a very dangerous message about the past to send young people, because that could then create that fantasy about, oh, maybe authoritarianism is going to solve our economic problems in the present.
Mm-hmm. So that nostalgia is not just coming from out of thin air, it is sort of shaped by the stories that people are telling about the past, exactly, even if they didn't experience it themselves.
And then the question is, and you're probably also good at, with your research answering, do young people grow out of it eventually, right?
Yeah, that's a question that I have. Do they grow out of it as as well? Like, what do you think? Do you think that this is young people being young, and as they sort of have more experience of the world, perhaps experience of the direct experience of the political system itself, do you think these views will change?
I mean, we only measured at one moment in time, but I know your work, and I know you've been looking into it, and you found some indications that there may be something?
Well, so essentially, there's what we call an age effect. So in the same way that young people, when they become older, start to like more, elegant music, there are things that you do just grow out of over time. And people's support for democracy does increase as they get older, as an age effect. Our statistical methods take that into account. So when I said they're more open to authoritarianism, that's over and above what we would expect already from that age effect. So historically, people have become more pro-democratic as they get older, but that's just historical data, and that hasn't happened in the same way for millennials. So it's possible that the same thing happens to Gen Z and Gen Alpha as well, that we don't see this maturation into pro-democracy that we've seen in previous cohorts, because the world has changed.
The world has changed, and as you mentioned, we've been through not just the global financial crisis, but now COVID. I mean, two really incredibly significant crises, and I would assume that those effects are long-lasting.
Yeah, I mean, and picture it, if you're this group that polled highest for us, early 30s, when they were teenagers, it was global financial crisis. When they started post-secondary education in these European countries, there was this big migration crisis, the big influx. Then they started their career, COVID. So it's really this crisis after, and they may have been utterly unhappy with how it was handled politically, and that then feeds the disillusionment. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's plausible, but yeah, there's a lot of controversy around this. Mm-hmm. I know, like in research, of whether it's people grow out of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I know that there's so much that I know that our audience will want to ask you about, and probably ideas about how to use these tools, this data. But I wanted to ask you, since this is a lightning round, is there one final thought you'd like to leave everyone with, just reflecting on your research?
So to facilitate young people's support of democracy, we have one priority looking backwards, and I think that's to dispel this myth that dictators bring development, and how important that is when young people are susceptible to authoritarianism, to really tackle that head on. And then one priority looking forwards, which is that young people's transitions into adulthood need to be safeguarded, especially during crises. School, training, housing, jobs. Because for democracy to have a viable future, young people need to have a viable future.
Okay, wow. Simon?
I think, oftentimes, it's not just here, when you hear people talk about the younger generation, it's sort of human nature to always worry and say, oh my God, where's this going to lead? Oh, great, they're now all about climate action, so they will save us. And then next year there's the next, oh my God, then it's bad again. So to be a bit more, I don't know. We should be looking into this, we should be worried, but it's a bit too emotional for my taste. I think there's enough evidence around that, there's also young people being young to some degree.
Yeah. All right, well, this has been an amazing conversation, and I know there's so much focus on the young, perhaps too much pressure on the idea that young people are the saviors of democracy, we're always looking for hope, but I feel like what I'm hearing from both of you is the need to both take those concerns extremely seriously, but also to kind of build the political structures and institutions that are going to kind of build that bridge into the future, but not only by relying on young people. Yes. Okay, all right, thank you so much.